All right. It looks like it's working now. It should be working. Let me
Excellent.
refresh my page to make sure. Yes. Okay, we are live, which is perfect. Um, we probably don't have anybody watching quite yet, so we have a few seconds.
Okay.
I'm going to get it so I can see the chat, and I'll read to you any chat messages that we get.
Excellent.
But anyway, let's go ahead and then start. So hello, everyone. My name is Ariana Coveney. I am the co-director of the Consent Academy, and we are a Seattle-based nonprofit that is focused on teaching about consent in all of its complexity and potential. And today we're talking with Jo Langford, who is also from Washington and is fabulous. Would you like to introduce yourself a bit, Jo?
Sure. Thank you. I haven't been called fabulous in a really long time. That's a nice way to end a weekend. My name is Jo Langford. I'm a therapist and a sex and tech educator for families and teenagers. Mostly the boy flavor tends to be what my practice is kind of comprised of. And I sort of specialize in that intersection of adolescence, sexuality, and technology, and the mess that those things can make when you smush them together.
Yeah, I imagine that as technology has become more ubiquitous and just sort of I don't know, integrated into every part of our lives, it's gotten more complicated to do the work that you do.
It has, I guess, complicated in kind of a simple way. It's all the same conversations. There's just this new layer of technology on it. I've been working with teenagers since I was one, and kind of have always had an important spot in my heart for LGBT youth, and then was working for a long time with kids with sexual behavior issues as well. So sexuality kind of became my weird wheelhouse, and then at some point technology became ubiquitous, like you said, and so now you can't. I tell parents all the time, you can't talk about sex without talking about technology, and you can't talk about technology without talking about sex. Those things are totally connected now. So
yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I always think about how you have these people who are kind of outliers in society. Some of the people who in many ways need the most help can have the hardest time finding help that they need. Like I've done a lot of, peer coaching with people who've say been accused of harm, and they accept that on some level that they've caused harm. And I try to help them navigate the process of dealing with that. And one of the things I found for a lot of them is that if they try to talk to a therapist about being accused of, say, assault or abuse or something, the therapist will just say, I'm not going to work with you anymore. And I imagine that's also really, especially in our really sex negative, kind of squeamish society, especially when it comes to children and teenager sexuality. If you have a teenager who has sort of sexual behavioral problems, finding a therapist who can help them with that is probably really, really, really difficult.
I agree. Definitely can be.
Yeah. So what kind of got you started in this work? You said you've been working with teenagers since you were a teenager. Could you start there?
Sure. I went to what was a pretty progressive high school at the time. They've kind of fallen by the wayside, I think, since then. But at the time, there was a handful of us. I think there were 6 of us that were peer counselors at my school, and we got direct supervision from these master's level therapists. So if a kid didn't want to talk to a grown up, they could come and talk to us, and we had hands on the shoulder kind of training for it. It was really fantastic and put me on a path. And I've worked in the foster care system, and I've worked in group homes, and I've had a private practice for a really long time. But so I've been doing some form of sort of counseling or therapy since I was 17 years old. So it's been really nice, I think. And I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I was working in a group home there with like adolescent gang members and addicts. And then I moved to Washington State and applied for a job doing the same kind of work. And there was like a set of homes, and they said, well, we only have a half-time slot, so why don't you work part-time here, and you can work part-time at this other house up on the hill with kids who have like sexuality issues. And so I kind of split my time, and and they said, when you get a full-time position, you can kind of move over. But then I ended up going the other direction because it was so fascinating, and actually felt like I was helping, and yeah, it's super interesting. And I've kind of hardly had a bored day at work, honestly, doing work with sexuality. It's super interesting and fascinating to me, more than like, I shot him because he had a red hat on. Like, that conversation can only go so far. But working with the kids around sexuality has been a really great thing for me.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine in some ways there is some overlap when it comes to like adolescence, coming of age, struggles with identity, struggles with coming into your own power. Like, I think about that a lot in an article I wrote recently. You can check it out on our Patreon, about why men should teach about consent, because I've seen a lot of people who say, I feel weird about that. I feel like they might have not the best intentions, or what are they going to know, or whatever. And I basically wrote this whole article about like that. Here's why that thinking is wrong, and men really should teach about consent. But one of the things I wrote at the end was that I've noticed a trend with a lot of men who do really care about these kinds of issues, feeling like they also ought to distance themselves from their masculinity, and to like feel like I can't be a man, because they associate masculinity and manhood with things like sexual violence. And I think that it kind of starts when we're adolescents and we start to come into our own power in different ways, right? It's like, the toddlers kind of do the same thing, where they start to realize, oh, I can actually like affect the world around me and make what I want happen. Yeah. And then
middle schoolers do that too.
And I mean, like, I think it's just really big. And I remember as a teenager really just being completely, I thought it was kind of a joke that like I would be seen as sexual and like desirous, and that I had any kind of power. So I did a lot of things that were very much not kind, like, and my female friends and I would get together and we'd invite a guy over that we wanted to torture, basically. And we'd like get into a fight, and then we were like wrestling each other on the bed, and then we'd be like taking his clothes off, and we would see how far we could take it before the guy ran away scared, basically. But like, one of the things that I also think is different here is that women's, girls, female, femme sexuality, a lot of the time is not seen as inherently dangerous. And so there's not as much of a fear reaction to it. But I think on the other side of things, we do tend to view the sexuality of men and boys and mask people as inherently more dangerous. Do you think that this kind of comes into play at all in the work that you do?
I think it definitely can. I think I'm not in the same category as like the people you're talking about who want to like turn down their masculinity in order to have these kind of conversations. Because I think it is super important for men to be talking to people about consent, because most of the time when consent goes south, like there's a guy involved and kind of steering that ship. And I really do think it's men's job to stop sexual assaults, not women's. And so I think being a man in that role visibly is really important. I also think guys tend to understand a little bit more where teenage guys are coming from when they cause the problems, which a lot of time is not on purpose, right? Very rarely does a teenage boy wake up and say, I'm gonna like mess up somebody's day to day, right?
Yeah.
But every message that guys get in media, music, video games, sports, like everything is like go, 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 push, 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 get that goal, replay that level as many times as you need to until you get to that thing. And so, being able to understand, like, how do you absorb all those messages all of your life, and then when you become sexually active, like it takes on a different flavor. It's not the same as trying to get a job or buying a car, right? Or getting the raise at work. It's a different dynamic, and that push, 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 go, go, go doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
And I don't really think that there's anything. Yes, like, almost all of the time, like they're like males are responsible for sexual assaults, right? Not every time, but it is, and most of the time, female identified people are the targets and the victims. Not all the time, but the majority of the time, 90% plus of the time, that's how it plays out. But I don't subscribe to the idea that there's anything inherent about masculinity that causes that. Just like I don't think there's anything inherent about femininity that equals victim. There's nothing inherent in masculinity that equals aggressor. It just plays out that way because of our culture. But masculinity is a very healthy, positive, powerful thing. It just needs to be directed and educated. And we don't talk about consent and power in that way in America, for sure.
Yeah, I wonder if, because I agree, I really love masculinity. Like, just personally speaking, internally, I don't really feel like I have a sense of gender. It, to me, just kind of all feels like I'm cosplaying or LARPing or whatever. But if I were to list it all out, I would identify with masculinity a fair bit more than femininity. And there's a lot I really love and appreciate about masculinity. And I sometimes worry that because we have such a strong narrative of men are perpetrators, women are victims, men are strong and they take, and women are weak and they give, and all of this binary bias in society, that we have a lot of shame around, we have these like weird sort of tangled up shames around sexuality and having sexual desire, but shame around, especially if you're a boy or a man, like not being very sexual. And I know that like in teenage boys sort of development socially, there's a lot of pressure to be like display and tell stories of sexual prowess. And then but I think deep down, most people don't want to hurt each other. So sometimes I wonder if, because we have all of these sort of contradictory and kind of harmful narratives around it, if people, when they do realize that they may have crossed a line, they have a sense of shame and also a sense of like, well, this is what it means to be a man, and I want to assert myself as this. So I can't even stop and think about the harms that might have happened or the ways I might have made someone uncomfortable. So I just need to keep pushing, and I got to go like push through it, basically.
I think that definitely happens sometimes, that idea like, well, this is what dudes do, this is how guys act, so I'm going to do this. But most of the time, actually, like in my office, especially with the chunk of my clients who see me because they've crossed like a line somewhere, right? Most of the time it is more around, I didn't realize that line was there, or that I should be looking for this line. Like they just don't know, like that overlap of like, like people who will like take the doll out of the boy's hands or not want him to cuddle with the puppy or something like that, right? Like, and those shows of where you do create, like facilitate those bonding hormones and nurture empathy, and you understand what it's like to like care for this other creature, right? There's a lot of barriers to boys doing that, and I think that plays out as they get older. And it's like, oh, I should be concerned about like not only where this person's lines and wants and not wants are, but like, are they having fun? Are they experiencing pleasure too? like that kind of basic level empathy that it's involved in sexual interactions. I think those muscles don't get very developed in a lot of guys, actually. And again, I think that comes back to some cultural stuff.
Yeah,
boys should play with dolls.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I just, yeah, we do a lot of policing of gender expression in children.
I was at the store the other day, and we like there's sunglasses are gendered in this country.
Yeah.
Why? It's like, it makes no sense, right? Everything is gendered in this country.
And there's always the sort of, I think, commonly made point that, you know, boys doing things like playing with dolls is not going to have a negative impact on them because it's giving them the same kind of practice. They might become a parent someday too. So it's good for them to practice learning how to hold a baby and look at the baby's face and interact with it. Though when I was a kid, I hated dolls and I just wanted to use them as projectiles to throw people and stuff. But, you know, I think that the point is still very clear. So I wanted to go to a different thing you brought up at the beginning, where you were talking about how, as technology has sort of inserted itself more into people's lives, we can't talk about sex without talking about technology. And it made me have a question that I hadn't thought of. But I remember when I was a teenager, there was a lot of like chat among teenagers, and I also kind of saw some of it from the adult side of people's definition of what is and isn't sex. So like most people would say it was just, you know, penetrative vaginal intercourse. And so people would be having oral sex or even anal sex and be like, I'm still a virgin. And I mean, as a teenager, I was one of those kids who was like, virginity is a social construct and it doesn't mean anything. And like, I don't like the idea of losing anything. Like I called it my sexual debut. And that's how I thought about it.
That's great. I mean, that's terrific. It's unusual. Like, you blew the bell curve. I think most adolescents do not think that. But yeah, that's great. That's how you should hold it.
Yeah, I mean, I was a weird kid. I mean, I'm still a weird person, but I was definitely a weird teenager. But I think about also the idea of sexting, and is that sex? And what do you think?
I think, well, it doesn't matter except to the person that you are doing that with, I think, is kind of what my answer would probably be. Because I do exercise with, when I talk to parents about how to talk to consent with kids, or with kids, like I do an exercise, and I have all these like placards with all kinds of levels of sex on them, and I put them up all around the room, and I'd say, hey, go, so figure out where your line is. Where do you think sex starts or virginity ends, right? And then go stand under that sign, and then you can just see like what a wide range people's definitions of sex are, and that why that's important to talk about that in the moment. And so, yeah, like I don't think I would consider sexting sex, but I would put it in the flirting category for sure. But somebody that I might be doing that with, or, you know, like they might consider that sex, and that would be important for me to know, I suppose, right? Just like my stance would be important for them to know.
Yeah, I think just thinking about it, for me, the way I would probably define it, especially with sexting, is like it could be flirting. I think it kind of depends on the intention of the activity. Like, is this an activity we're both engaging in for the sake of helping each other achieve orgasm? And if that's the case, then I would say it is sex. Like if we're doing this to the point that we want to help each other achieve an orgasm and also experience one ourselves, then yes. But then I would also say that like, that's so hard, because then I also think about things like people doing manual manipulation of each other's genitals, and like, is that sex? And
right.
To me, I would say like it's a type of sex for sure.
Yeah, it's sexual for sure. Yeah, but that's cool. That's an interesting definition. I haven't heard that before. That's really like the activities that are designed to bring one or both people to the point of orgasm. Like that's cool. I like that.
Yeah, because to me, I mean, this is really much like off the top of my head, but I feel like that was kind of my internal sense of it as a teenager as well. And that's also, I think, because from a very young age, my definition of things is like, this should be mutually pleasurable. And like, if it's not, if it's like very much an act of service from one person to the other, as long as that's what the person wants to be doing, okay. But I also think that there should be reciprocity involved. And
that is often a lot of the kids I work with, the first time they've heard that word is when I bring it up in situations like that, and oral sex too. Let's talk about reciprocity.
Yeah, I mean, as a teenager, I was very much of the mind of like, I'm not going to perform oral sex on someone who would not perform oral sex on me. And like, I remember when I don't know, I think it was after university, just hearing the number of women that I knew who were just like, I've faked most of my orgasms. And I'm like, I literally don't understand how you can fake an orgasm. And also like, what do you mean you're not holding your sexual partner accountable at all? You're not like saying, hey, we're not done here. But yeah, I mean,
I call a version of that out in my book. Like I say, like, don't ask someone to put their mouth anywhere on your body that you're not willing to put on theirs. Like, even with like anal sex, like, great guys, you go first. Because it enhances empathy, right? It shows them how slow it needs to go at first, right? Like, yeah, I think reciprocity is very important.
Yeah, I do think so as well. And so then, you're in this kind of very specialized therapeutic role. What are the main challenges working with kids who've been referred to see you?
Well, I mean, consent comes up all the time, and screens a lot. A lot of problems happen with screens. And one of the issues is that like everything that teenagers have always done since the beginning of time, they're still doing. They're just doing it through their screens now instead of in real life, and almost doing it like reverse. Like, they'll send pictures, like they'll see each other naked and then decide if they want to go to the movies together or something, right? It's totally like flip-flop than what most adults experienced growing up. And I think, talking about that whole host of human interactions, like body language and, all that stuff that doesn't get translated through screens, in kind of talking about like, you're only seeing like a very small pie slice of what communication is when you're only communicating through screens. And it's very different than doing it in real life, and talking about, when you're reduced to just, mostly using words in your texts to each other, or maybe emojis, I guess, but how even more important it is to sort of clarify terms about what you're talking about. Because back to the gender things, right? Like, we are all so socialized, and so some of the terms that we have for sex are very vague and don't actually mean anything, right? Like doing it, right? Or fooling around, or making love. Like, what the hell does that mean? Like, that could mean 87 different things if you ask 67 different people, right? So when you're talking to someone, especially through a screen, you have to be really clear, like, what are you actually suggesting that you do? And then, is that even a good idea to make promises, like make future promises if you're both 15 and you're sexting, right? Like, probably that's on a basic level, like, that's not even a good idea to be doing, right?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I can't imagine the whole like seeing each other naked and then deciding if you want to go to the movies. Like, now I feel kind of old.
It's amazing.
Because I'm like, wow, it's changed so much.
It's and part of me is just like, all right, yay for self-esteem. Like, when I was 13 and a half, like, I would have lit myself on fire if anyone saw me naked. Like, and now they're just like passing out pictures, like, Pokemon cards or something. Part of me is just super impressed with their sense of self and their level of self-esteem with it. But I'm also like, please stop doing that. Like, here's how you flirt in real life, which is another problem, I would say, with kids, right? Like, none of them know how to flirt in real life. There's no role models for that anymore, right? There's like, goofy sitcom fails and the big grand "will you marry me" gestures in movies, neither of which most teenage boys watch very much anymore. There's zero role models for flirting. Nobody knows how to do it. So a lot of the work that I do is actually like teaching kids, how do you actually talk to another human that you actually like and care about and want to get to know better and maybe be naked with at some point? Like, how do you do that? They have no idea.
Goodness. We have a comment in chat from Dustin about when do you break up, delete the pictures? I imagine this is also something you talk with people you work with about.
Yeah, I mean, still in so many places around the country, like it's actually illegal. If anyone involved in the exchanging of those pictures is under 18, like it can be on a federal level, called like child sex abuse material or child porn. And so being able to talk to kids about that and all the myths that they have, like, well, we're both 15. Well, she sent a picture first. That does not make it okay. Like, it's still not okay, right? You can get in a massive amount of trouble. Some states are balancing out, and Washington is one of them, actually. And I've talked to some people like with the ACLU about how to kind of hold those differently. If there's two people and they're both happen to be underage, but they're only exchanging pictures with each other, and they're not doing anything else on those pictures that would also otherwise be illegal, like that they're not kind of looking at those in the same way as like, the guy that took his ex-girlfriend's pictures and sent them to the whole soccer team. Like, that's a different kind of issue, right? Or adults who are trying to get pictures from kids. Those things are kind of different. But yeah, talking about how do you manage that media in a respectful and safe and smart way for everybody involved is, I have those conversations on a pretty regular basis.
It's so fascinating. It's just really interesting because sometimes I have a hard time remembering that for a lot of people, there is still a tremendous amount of shame associated with just like being sexual and doing silly, funny, foolish things with each other. Because to me, when I was younger, and this wasn't until university, but if I was exchanging nudes with somebody, my main thought was, if people release these to other people, then everyone will know how hot I am and like whatever. And or I was just like, I'm only going to send pictures that if a lot of people saw it, I would be like nice about. And that's just very much like, I think some of it is because I had been so used to these sort of consent violations of like, I don't have the expectation that if I send one of these pictures to somebody that they will then just keep the picture to themselves. They won't keep it after we've broken up. They won't share it with other people. So I was automatically assuming that my sort of consent would be
that is broken. Awesome. But I would say breaking the bell curve. Like, most kids don't, that's what I try to do. Like, say things like, would you be okay if the whole school saw that picture? Like, would you be okay if your grandmother saw that post? Like, like, kids don't really think about that. Like, in the moment, like a lot of kids, it's like they don't have enough blood to run both ends of their body at the same time. And you being able to think ahead and have a standard of what kind of pictures you send out is amazing. And I spend a ridiculous amount of time trying to get kids to that place because they have no shame, right? Like, until they get in trouble. And then it's like, it's all about the shame, right? Because again, that's America, I think, is set up in a lot of ways like that. But like there's something magic about that distance between, there's like this device between me and you, right? and that gives them a sense of like invulnerability and safety, and they don't often think beyond that, right? So shame does not factor into those things in the moment.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's very, very interesting to think about it on all these different levels. I mean, also, like, I'm genuinely more embarrassed by my high school yearbook photo because it was Halloween and I didn't realize no one was allowed to wear costumes at my high school. And it was also yearbook photo day. And I showed up wearing like a sparkly cat collar and cat ears and like a really like lacy, frilly dress. And then I was just like, yes, in my picture. And I'm like, I don't want anyone to see that. That's embarrassing. But then
in the moment, that seemed like a great idea. You were totally into it.
Yeah, in the moment I was. In the moment I was like, yeah, I'm cool. Look at, I wear like cosplay every day to school because I'm a nerd. And now I'm just like, that's a bit cringy.
Yeah, trying to get kids to think about their behavior outside of that moment right now when your genitals are tingling, right? Like it's crazy. Like talking to boys about the flirting thing, right? And I'm like, sending a picture of your penis to someone is a terrible way to flirt, right? And explaining to them, like, girls don't even tend to like looking at penises in the same way that boys like looking at girls' swimsuit areas. Like, it's not on the scale. It does not necessarily exactly play out. There's a lot of other things that girls may be more interested in seeing than like a big picture of your penis. And yes, you wouldn't whip it out in the hallway at school or after soccer practice. Why would you do that, right?
I've always been curious about this. Is like, in what ways is unsolicited dick pics different from flashing somebody? And I guess like the only real difference is this, like, we assume that flashers are always like perfect strangers and doing it in a fully public place versus, if you're sending a nude, there's this assumption that you intentionally exchanged phone numbers. But I'm like, if my boss sends me an unsolicited dick pic, I feel like that's the same as if he just whipped it out in the office. I would just be like, the same level of discomfort. Though in a live situation, I would probably laugh. I mean, probably if I got it on my phone, I would laugh too, because it would seem like a joke to me. But yeah, what do you think? What is the difference between an unsolicited dick pic and flashing something?
I think there's something about, again, that distance, that buffer of a device between the two people. Because every adolescent girl client that I've had in my office in the last decade has had at least one person send a picture of them. And I say, if someone showed you their penis in a parking garage, you would call the damn police, right? And they're like, oh, of course. I'm like, why is it different? Because it's on your phone. And they go, oh, I don't know, right? It's crazy. And I think what happens is they can kind of make up stories about it, and then it sort of creates like this weird cycle, right? So, like they'll get the picture and they'll go, he likes me, right? And then they respond, and then the guy goes, oh, it worked, cool. Because we're trained to respond to people, right? Like, for all that host of communication stuff that doesn't get translated through screens, mirror neurons still happen, right? And so I've had a lot of girls, even, and some boys too, say like, I sent pictures back because I felt kind of rude not sending them, right?
It feels, oh my goodness. Again, I'm just feeling like, wow, I'm not one of the kids anymore because things have changed.
Yeah.
We get a couple of interesting comments in chat. Aradin said, I don't even really like seeing myself naked. I certainly wouldn't want anyone else to see it. Argelos wrote, what about harm reduction in this context versus discouraging and abstaining? So like if kids are going to send nudes, harm reduction versus abstaining. But I want to come back to that in a second because there's a couple other.
That's a great question.
Noxic said, I wouldn't say the increase in nudes is because they have better self-esteem, probably the opposite. They're relying on the receiver to praise them and give them body confidence. most young people I've met have terribly low self-esteem in the wake of social media, expectations going through the roof. Yeah,
Yeah,
would
I agree.
absolutely
It's a guaranteed way. Like that person will be super into me for 5 whole minutes if I send them this picture. Yeah.
And then someone asked implied safety of distance with the phone. And I would say, I think that is what we're talking about, is that, I mean, I think another way to think about it is there's the trolley problem. For anyone who doesn't know what it is, it's like an ethics problem. You have a trolley that can go one of 2 tracks. There's 5 people on one track and there's 1 person on the other. It's currently set to go to hit 5 people, but you can pull a lever and it will only hit 1 person. And a lot of people say they would pull the lever, but then the next level is, well, what if you were to push that 1 person off the bridge in front of the tracks, and that would be enough to stop the train and save the 5 people, but you had to physically push them. And a lot of people are like, whoa, because the distance, just the little distance of like not having to look the person in the eyes, pulling a machine really creates this difference. And
I'm not doing anything to them. I'm doing something to the lever.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And then someone asked, how do you change the story people self-generate in these situations of, oh, it must mean they like me, or it would be rude not to send a nude back. What do you think about that one? How would you change the narrative there?
I think it's all about media literacy. So I think that I spend a lot of my time doing that as well, right? And the ways that we have like acculturated young women in America to acquiesce and to smile and to make nice and to go along. Just it makes me want to light myself on fire sometimes. It's awful. So really like actually giving kids permission. You do not have to reciprocate in bullying situations too. Like just because they say something shitty to you, you do not have to say something back. And really giving kids like an actual out. Like you do not have to feel obligated to do this. And understanding those dynamics, like, yes, if you send a picture of your chest to stuff, like you're definitely going to get attention. Of course, you're going to get attention. And is that the kind of attention you're wanting? Is that real attention, or is that just situational attention that is going to be fleeting and not last? Is that what you want? And just getting them to kind of rise above a little bit and get sort of meta and thinking about their behavior is a huge thing for teenagers. And they all get there eventually, but that's really more of like a 16, 17-year-old developmental dynamic. And the problem is that, you know, we give these things to kids age 12, right? And we don't tend to talk to them about those kinds of issues until something terrible hits the fan. And then we have to go have a talk about how to use your phone. There's not enough proactive, you know, how do you drive this thing like a car, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's a really good point, is like thinking of it as it has the same potential to damage lives as a car does, and you have to treat it with just as much care and respect.
I use that metaphor all the time when I'm talking to parents, right? Like, raise your hand if you're going to give your kid keys one day and say, go learn how to drive, have fun. Nobody ever raises their hand, but there's this whole thing where we just like give kids a phone for their birthday or the 7th night of Hanukkah or whatever, and then there's just no conversation about it because kids know the technical parts of these better than the parents most of the time, right? And so the parents tend to kind of feel like they don't know what they're talking about and back off. But I'm like, the social dynamics of how do you interact with the other human on the other side of that device, like kids don't know that. Like that's up to us to teach them that, right? So
yeah, that's very interesting. A couple other things in chat. Argala said, I find myself doubting if the intention of sending nudes is really a way of flirting. Like mentioned above, it can have different intentions, like looking for confidence. So let's go back to the previous question that Argala asked, which is like, how do you do harm reduction in this space versus telling kids like abstain, don't send nudes, don't do it? What kind of harm reduction do you do in that space?
Yeah, because they're going to do it anyway. right? So I think a lot of it is harm reduction, and there's, I don't know, what do I do in terms of that? At the basic point, I don't let kids use the word sexting in my office unless they're over 18, right? I said, when they do it, I make them hold their hands up and do sarcastic quotation marks when they say the word. So I said, because I said, that's not what you're talking about. Like, that is only for people who are over 18, right? But let's talk about digital flirting. Okay, great. What are the rules for that, right? Where they can still have these interactions with people, but I say things like, like, have a standard for your pictures in the state that you're in. These are the rules, and these are the laws, and here's the line that you can cross. So make sure your pictures don't cross that line. Talking about what already happened, right? You can talk all you want, wax philosophically about what's already happened. Don't make future promises, because that kind of locks people into a gear sometimes that they can't get out of in the moment, right? Oh, I can't wait until Saturday night when we do an A and B and C and D. And then all of a sudden they're there together on Saturday night, and maybe neither of them want to do C or D, but they already said that they were going to. And what does that mean, right? So, talking about things like that, keeping it PG-13, right? Just reminding them, like, there could be somebody else who sees these, like the person that you're writing to's best friend. It could be the person you're writing to's parents. So, you want to kind of keep that in mind before you hit send, that sort of stuff. So showing kids how to flirt through their phones in a way that's not going to cause harm to them or other people is a really important thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really good. Keeping the language focused on things, trying to keep it age appropriate. Someone in chat has mentioned porn, like porn and sexualized media in general has left us really desensitized to seeing naked bodies on screen. I agree, it feels like a buffer. You can pose carefully, use filters, check it with a friend before you send it, etc. And there's also been some discussion of like, does everybody, like any gender, check it with friends, or is it mostly girls who do it? And I would also agree, probably most likely girls, because
I think so.
especially because we have such a homophobic society and culture that I would have a hard time imagining that being something people felt very comfortable with. Some countries it might be different, but at least in America.
Yeah. I mean, with not straight guys, lots of penises flying back and forth there. But for the typical straight guy, he's not going to say, "Hey, how's my dick look, dude?" Right? Like, they're not going to do that. But I do think like some girls probably would do that.
Yeah. So then, related to this, I do want to talk about porn a little bit, because I do think it's an important thing that often gets left out of any sex talk with kids. Like, but also a lot of kids, interact with porn before their parents ever talk to them about sex.
Yep.
The average first porn exposure, as we talked about last week, Ash and I, is like 8 to 11. I was definitely right about that age the first time I saw pornography. And it wasn't internet porn. It was just, my friend was like, "Hey, do you want to see something funny? Look at the dirty magazines my dad keeps under his mattress." And luckily for me, like, my mother had already given me the talk, so I really knew what was up. And to me, I approached it very like clinically, because again, I was a weird kid. I was like, oh, like, and a lot of the things, there was like articles about like different things you could do. And I was just like, this is not anatomically possible. And that was my approach to it. I was like 7 and, one of those kids. But I recognize, again, I'm very much an outlier here, but I was very lucky to have a mom who felt very comfortable answering the questions I actually had, following my lead on things, and responding to the ways in which I was curious and wanted to know about, like, well, how did my little brother get made? And how do you think parents should talk with kids about things like pornography?
Well, one of the sentences I probably say most is to talk to kids about this before you think you need to talk to kids about this, because of those stats, right? How young the average age of exposure was. It's hell and gone from like, late 80s, early 90s. Like, for most people, like the the average age of first porn exposure was like statistically around like 15 or 16. And now it is like 8, 9, 10, right? And again, with you blowing the bell curve, right? I actually was too. My first porn was like magazines, right? But it has been, I can't even remember the last time I had a kid in my office who saw still pictures, right? It is all graphic, moving HD images that we're all used to now. But sometimes, you know, when you, as we know, like if you pour adult sexuality onto like a developing brain that's not quite ready for it, it can be really traumatizing. And there are lots of kids who are like 12, 13, 11, 10, right? Like looking at porn, and it is traumatizing to them and they don't understand what that feeling is in their body, right?
Right.
And I regularly have kids who, you know, have been looking at porn for a year, 2 years, 3 years before they even got their first pubic hair, right? Like,
Yeah.
what does that do to your developing brain, right? And I'm not an anti-porn person. Like, porn is awesome if you are, you know, grown up, sense of yourself as a sexual creature, and you have a sex life, and you look at porn, like nobody cares, right? That's not an issue, right? But creating a sense of sexuality, or creating a sense of yourself as a sexual person out of someone else's imagination, right? Like that can really cause problems for kids. And you know, you and I talked about this before, and you know, saying like that there is no other media genre, right, that I can think of where there's not a YA category first that kids can get into and experience before they wade into the bigger pool, right? Movies, music.
YA means a young adult. Like,
yeah. There's picture books, there's young adult novels, there's books, there's movie ratings, video game ratings. You know, like porn is the only thing where there's not like a Disney Junior version of for kids. When they jump in, they're in the deep end of the adult pool, splashing around in there, and it's really hard for a lot of them.
It's really interesting because I've been trying to talk with people about this idea, and I have some friends who I've talked to about it who've recently had children, and the main reaction I've gotten is kind of like stunned silence and maybe a little bit of terror at the idea of like there being a young adult option for pornography, and like kind of just like that's horrifying. And I'm kind of like, yeah, but here's the thing, it's like as a kid, especially by the time I was in middle school, early high school, torrenting was popular. My friends and I would just torrent huge porn archives and then just watch all of it like together as friends, because we were like, let's see how weird things can be. Let's see what, and then that was not good. Like I do think that I talked about it a little bit last week. Disney had a pretty big effect on me because Disney also has a lot of like adult themes in it that they assume kids aren't really going to pick up on, that I definitely picked up on. Like I think about Aladdin with the like sexy slave Jasmine with like being tied up and like just all of that stuff. And there was like the whole possession thing in Hunchback of Notre Dame. And there's like, you know, the sort of loss of voice with Ariel and the ways those things are kind of sexual. Like there was, and as a little kid, I definitely like was like, oh, there's a lot of themes of like men possessing women and having these very dom sub relationships. And like I got that messaging, but because it was acted as though kids aren't going to pick up on this, there was never any discussion of it. And that also then affected later the kinds of pornography that I thought was very normative and typical, because I'm like, well, this is the continuation of the same themes. And I feel like the other end of it is like, if we don't have an age appropriate option, we're not going to be able to stop kids from looking at these things.
Right.
And therefore we have to think about what's the way we can reduce harm. And I do not mean like pornography that is involving people under 18, but something more age appropriate, even just like softcore porn, which is like basically not a thing anymore.
Right. Well, I mean, so, you know, porn literacy, I think is a very real thing that we should be doing more with kids, like talking to them about porn and you know, the big picture problems with it, but like small, you know, picture like individual issues that it can create with them, and how to kind of hold that like concept and phenomenon for themselves, and put it into some kind of sense that they can make of it. I think is really important with kids. But yeah, like, I mean, and I've talked to, you know, families and said, you know, hey, like there's still sort of Playboy Penthouse, right, for kids of a certain age. Then at least with the still pictures, even though it's like caveman stuff, right? Like they can still, they have to fill in all the gaps with their imagination, like find erotica books, right? For their Kindle, and then let them go to town and let them use their own imagination muscles. Because when kids are only using a screen, right, which happens almost all of the time now, right, there's no imagination muscles at all, and you need those for like romance, empathy, right, all that stuff we were talking about earlier, right? You have to have good imagination muscles. And with a lot of guys, like their imagination are just atrophied, because, you know, I had a 17-year-old in my office a couple of months ago. I actually had two kids over the age of 16 in my office, or I'm only doing Zoom stuff, but over Zoom, right? Saying that that they weren't, like, one of them was like, well, I'm not looking at I'm not masturbating. I haven't masturbated for a few weeks. You know? And I was like, well, how come? Because he had a goal to stop looking at porn, right? So we said, well, I'm not looking at porn, so I'm not masturbating. And I was like, you know, you can masturbate without looking at porn, right? And he was like, but he thought the words were interchangeable. Like he didn't have a concept of it. Like so many kids I work with have never masturbated without looking at porn. It's crazy. That's never happened in human history before.
Yeah, that's really fascinating and sad. I mean, like, it is sad to me to think about that, because it's also like, you know, the porn industry. I saw this article the other day that was like porn in the time of war, and it said that since the Ukrainian crisis has started, on most major porn sites, the top searches are things like Ukrainian girls, desperate Ukrainian girl, something to do with a Ukrainian girl and a Russian soldier. And it's very like upsetting to think about people wanting to prey on that kind of desperation and real threat to life and everything. But I also think that that's, you know, especially with the fact that there is so much more pornography now than at any point in time in history. Like, porn's always existed. If you watched my thing last week, you know that I'm very pro porn. I think that I personally love like humor porn, because I think we should bring more joy and silliness and stuff to sexuality. But the porn industry is always chasing the next sensational thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's also really hard for kids. Like, if you learn about what sex is supposed to look and feel and sound and be like from pornography, you don't see any discussion of consent, boundaries. You don't see any aftercare usually. And even aftercare is not just a thing for the kink world. It's like, you should have that regardless. Even the like oldest female author, Murasaki Shikibu, who wrote the Tale of Genji and everything, she had this whole section of like treatises she wrote on sex with her lovers. And she said the ultimate sin is when a lover leaves the bed too quickly after sex and everything's like, right? People have been talking about aftercare forever. And then also just like, you don't see people actually connecting with each other. There's no connection there. It's very like mechanical and performative for the camera. And I usually don't believe that the people are enjoying themselves. Like, obviously it's a job, right? And so it might not actually be that enjoyable, but I just,
and the categories are super cringy, right? Like, you know, we were talking about empathy a while ago, like in a time where like there's terrible things happening in the world that could have impacts on everyone, right? And in a moment where, you know, we should be like feeling empathy for Ukrainian people. Like, why are people turning it sexual? Like, why are we sexualizing this? And we should be like having empathy for this, right?
Yeah.
There's been it's been like a group of kids that have talked about, like, and when talking about their porn and shame, right? That there's these kids who like all the incest genres, right? The brother and stepsister, the foster mom and the kid, like that kind of stuff. Um, and what it comes out a lot of times is that's the only genre in porn where there's a buildup. There's a little bit of like tension and a little bit of flirting and romance and kind of a buildup to like the sex, right? It's not just like, here's your pizza, right? Like there's more, like there's a storyline that goes on, and actually that is what kids are interested in, right? And I'm like, well, if they just said it was him and the girl next door, it would be totally fine, right? But in the porn industry, they tag those videos as like, you know, bro and foster sister, sister-in-law, like, you know, they familiarize it and call it the incest porn. But that's not why a lot of people look at that genre.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do think that there's a whole discussion that we could have on just like trends and epochs in pornography.
Oh yeah.
And we should say that for another time.
Okay.
We're almost out of time. I do have, there's a very good comment here from Aradin, who says, going back to the comparison of the phone to the car, I still think there's a huge difference in awareness of physical harm as opposed to mental or social harm. And I think that's a lot of also like what you're talking about, right? Is that people don't learn, especially not young enough, that physical harm is not the only type of harm, and that sex is a very powerful thing. It makes me think of, I have these two cousins who I'm quite a bit older than, and I would babysit them for my aunt. And one time I saw them chatting on like their Nintendo DS. There was like a game that they could chat. And I saw the chat, and it was all these other little kids, and it was just swears. It was swears. And they were so worried that they were going to be in trouble, that I was going to like tell their mom. And I was like, what I said to them was like, okay, first of all, you're not in trouble. Like, it's kind of cute, but also like that you all just get together and all you little kids, all you want to do is say the bad words. But I said, you know, here's the truth of it. Swearing is fantastic. It's fun. It's expressive. It lets me, like, I love to swear. It helps me express myself more clearly sometimes. And the reason why adults don't want children to do it is because swears are really powerful, and they can really, really hurt people. They can make people think less of you. They can ruin a relationship or an interaction. And you don't really know enough yet about the world and all these contexts. You have to kind of get more experience first before you'll be able to use this really powerful tool well and precisely. So it's not that
I love that
swearing is bad. It's that you don't have enough life experience yet to be able to swear effectively. So it's okay if you're practicing it with your friends, like that's fine. And like, you're not in trouble with me, but outside of these little moments with your friends, you have to wait, because it's a very powerful tool. And they both were like on the edge of their seat, like, oh, cool. Oh, and they felt like, okay, now I get why my parents don't want me to do this. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, like, swearing's fantastic. I'm
a big fan. With my kids, you know, I didn't want them to be like the kid on the playground that either heard the word and didn't know what it was, or that was using the word and using it incorrectly. So we had lots of conversations about respectful swearing and swear words. And, you know, I had, you know, a conversation with my daughter once that, you know, the evolution of the word bitch over the last 50 years and how that word has changed 18 times. And with my son, we had one, you know, he said, what's the difference between an ass, a jackass, and an asshole? And I was like, oh, those are different things. Like, yeah, let's talk about that. And it was awesome conversations. But yeah, that kind of ideology is very interesting to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of this has to come down to like respecting that kids are gonna learn about the world faster than we're gonna be able to teach them about it. That they're going to learn a lot from each other and a lot from the internet. And we also need to meet kids where they're at. Like, we can't just, you know, pretend like they're not learning these things and pretend like they're not having these experiences. I remember,
or that it's not a good thing, right? Like I'm a huge fan of the internet, and this particular cohort that we're talking about, like the Gen Z kids, like they're going to change the world. Like I love how connected and aware that they are with stuff, and I'm also very aware myself of like the problems that can cause. Like if we can eliminate some of those, like do the harm reduction, like they were saying, and eliminate some of those bad things, like it's a really nice combination to be young and have that much information and worldview at their fingertips.
Yeah, for sure. So we're basically out of time. I do want to give a shout out. You have a book. Do you want to talk about that for just a second?
Sure. I have a few, but two of them are looking for new publishing homes. But the one that is still out and floating around right now is the Pride Guide, which will hopefully be helpful to people in a couple of months as we get into Pride season. Yay. So, you know, I've worked with kids for a really long time, and, you know, I've had numerous trans clients over the years, and finding resources for them is always really difficult. And I think it must have been 2017. And I was like, why is there not like a puberty? What's happening to my body? How do I deal with this stuff? Book for like queer kids. So I wrote it. I'm really proud of it. It's a fun book, lots of humor. You know, same with you. Like I like talking about this stuff, and so I definitely use humor when I talk about things. And so yeah, it's out there. It's all my books, you know, are kind of written for kids, but there's a whole section in the back for their grown-ups.
Awesome.
In their lives. Yeah. So like how to be supportive of LGBTQ youth, and how to like handle your homophobia, what that looks like and what you can do about it. And, you know, questions that they ask. Cause, you know, I think the parents of queer kids really can struggle. It's one of the only minority populations where LGBT kids grow up in a family typically whose parents are not LGBTQ. So it's giving parents a little bit of an edge about, you know, you're in charge of this, like you have to be aware of the culture and the history, and you have to teach that to your kid, even if it wasn't your culture or history. You have to get in there and learn about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. And so I recommend you can get the book. I think it's good. I think it's very timely, especially with Pride coming up. And for everyone else who's watching, you can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us here on Twitch. I think this should work to hear all of our social medias. We have Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and then we also have a Patreon. If you want to support us there, you can get extra perks, you can get access to articles, and we will definitely have Jo on again in the future. There's a lot more to talk about sort of helping kids, improving their sort of development and teaching them about consent. We really only scratch the surface of all the cool things we could talk about. So thank you very much for joining me today. And thank everybody for joining us and watching.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.